The old man awoke early. Sleep had not been his companion during the night. Like one who would come after him, he spent much of the night glued to the ground, praying to the God he had always known and loved and trusted. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Years and years on this earth had left the scars of arthritis in his hips and his knees, and so he could not remember the last time he had been able to fall to the floor in prayer. But the pain in his knees and hips was nothing compared to the agony that lay heavy on his heart. And so he prayed that perhaps he had misunderstood, prayed that this cup might pass from him, prayed for some way out. It's the only prayer you pray when the rug has been pulled out from under you and everything you thought to be good and right in the world was suddenly very, very wrong. The words continued to pound through his mind like a drumbeat that would not cease. Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. And so, trusting in the God who had not failed him yet, Abraham saddled his donkey. He gathered the wood for the burnt offering, took 2 of the young men who helped around the house, and he took his son Isaac, the one he called Laughter, the one he loved, the one in whom his hopes and dreams dwelled, the one through whom God had promised so much. And together they set out for Moriah. Abraham took the lead for much of the journey, confident that if his son and the others walked behind him, well, then they wouldn't have the opportunity to see the tears staining with streaks on his face. But on occasion, he needed the others to lead the way, for there were more than a multitude of moments when their naivete was the only thing that kept this caravan moving, the only thing that allowed Abraham to have the courage and the faith to put one foot in front of the other. And as they traveled on, Abraham could not help but think back on all that had come to pass, all that God had promised. It had been some years now since God had called upon him to uproot himself and his whole family from their homeland. Get you going, Abraham, to a place that I will show you, and I will make of you a great people. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. This God who had called Abraham into covenant was the same God who assured him he would be the ancestor to a multitude of nations. A multitude of nations that, as we remember, would not be born out of Ishmael, who he bore through his servant Hagar, but through Isaac. Isaac, who came from his wife Sarah, Sarah, whose womb had only ever been barren. Abraham laughed quietly to himself as he walked along behind the others, remembering the questions he had asked of God in the midst of these seemingly impossible promises. Asking how a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man could ever bear a child. He remembered his doubt. He remembered Sarah's laughter. Remembered God's faithfulness. Remembered the birth of his son Isaac. And suddenly his feet felt heavy beneath him as if they were stuck in the midst of thickening mud. He could not go on. Not only was he struggling under the agony of this impending task, but suddenly all the promises of this supposedly faithful God now hung in the balance. The old man's thoughts once again turned to tears, cries of lament leaping from his heart to a God in whom he placed his trust. And that journey toward Moriah continued. These dusty sandals of Abraham are shoes we cannot even imagine ourselves standing in. They are shoes that disgust us, horrify us, shoes that cause us to question not only the one walking in them, but the one who has called them to walk. We question out of our own discomfort, we question out of fear, we question because there is no rational or sensible part of our beings where we can place a God who has asked for the life of a child, or a man whose steps toward Moriah communicate to that God, not my will, but thy will be done. It is so far from anything that we can imagine, which is why we're inclined to toss it aside, chalk it up to one of those Bible stories we'd just rather read once a year and not worry too much about. And that was my initial inclination as well. But if I've struggled through this text for a few days, I've decided you can at least struggle with me for a few minutes this morning. Misery does love company. And I'll be honest, there are times I love preparing a sermon. The text is rich, it's full of opportunities for exploration, it's alive, it's exciting. And then there are other times. And in this particular instance, this text seems to have made a comfortable home in the pit of my stomach, like a greasy burrito I really should not have eaten. I mean, what kind of God would ask for such a sacrifice? What kind of man would follow through on such a request? What was Abraham thinking? I mean, certainly, yes, he showed extraordinary faith in the midst of horrendous circumstances. But is this seemingly blind and trusting faith something we are actually called to emulate? I think of my own parents asking in a fit of anger, well, if your friend Megan asked you to jump off a cliff, would you do that too? And then I look at God, this supposedly loving God who tests Abraham in an act of faith that seems wholly immoral. This God who, unlike the humanity God created, does not break promises, and yet must know that every promise God has ever made to Abraham now hangs in the balance. God has asked so much of Abraham, and it still isn't enough. Well, God, today you've done it. Today you make doing justice and loving kindness look like a walk in the park, because today you have asked for everything. Abraham, if your good and faithful God asked you to kill your own son, would you do that too? Abraham answers the question perhaps with tears in his eyes, pain in his heart. We fill in the blanks because the text doesn't give itself away, but he answers the question with a knife in his hand, ready to do what has been asked of him. He places his trust, his life, the life of his son, into the hands of the one who brought forth the gift of that son in the first place. Abraham's answer is yes. And we are appalled. We want Abraham's answer to be no. We want him to call to question this God, to at least argue for the life of his son in the same way he did for the wicked city of Sodom. We need for his answer to be no. No is an answer we can relate to. No is an answer that seems human. No is a response we can understand. But with his knife raised and a heart weeping but ready, Abraham responds. And the angel of the Lord cries out to him, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Through this test, as the text calls it, as horrifying as it may be for us to read and to hear, we learn something very significant about Abraham. We learn that his love for the giver exceeds his love for this good and wonderful gift. In an act of faith that both troubles us and astounds us, we are confronted by a man, a human being who responded to God's call in every single way imaginable, saying, "Not my will, but your will be done." Perhaps part of the reason it horrifies us so much is because it convicts us so deeply, opening our eyes to perhaps the far simpler things that we hear God calling us to do, opening our eyes to the daily moments when we have failed to love God at all, much less with our whole lives. In small but profound ways, we also learn more about God in this text. If we listen carefully, we realize that God learned something about Abraham that day. Did you hear it? For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. God, in all of God's greatness, did not know how this journey toward Moriah would end. And let's be honest, God has already been burned several times before. God was betrayed in the Garden of Eden in the first generation, witnessed the murder of a brother in the second, watched in sadness and horror as the escalation of violence filled the world. With the flood, God sought to wipe the slate clean, but nothing really changed. And so with the call of Abraham, God seeks a new strategy. God enters into a covenant relationship with Abraham, offering faithfulness, love, and vulnerability. God trusted Abraham, but the very nature of a covenant relationship is one that requires love and vulnerability, knowing that rejection could come just as easily as mutual affection. And in the midst of this covenant, God had to be sure that Abraham loved God more than anything, more than anyone. After all, Abraham was the one through whom God had promised to bring blessing to a multitude of nations. And so in the midst of Abraham's long and painful journey toward Moriah, God too walked alongside him, vulnerable, praying, hoping. I'm aware that this knowledge of Abraham, this knowledge of God, it doesn't make this text any easier to swallow. I have ached for an innocent boy, a boy who perhaps will never be able to trust again, and certainly not his father. I have ached for a father who perhaps will be unable to look his son in the eye again, for the pain is just too difficult to bear. And believe it or not, I have ached for a God whose good and wonderful plans didn't go so well for quite a while. A God who was betrayed again and again, and yet a God who, in the midst of that painful betrayal, was willing to be vulnerable once again with the man named Abraham. There is much about this story that remains a mystery. Many questions that will go unanswered, many efforts on our part to fill in the blanks. But through God's vulnerability, as he journeyed alongside Abraham toward Moriah, God opened the door for a multitude of nations to be born from this one man. A multitude whose lineage would eventually lead us to a little town called Bethlehem, to another faithful servant who bore into this world a very vulnerable baby boy. And driven by a vulnerable and loving God who demands everything and who stops at nothing to redeem a fallen creation, This baby boy grew up, became a man, and this man journeyed toward another Moriah on our behalf. He carried a cross on his back instead of sticks for a fire. But like Abraham, he spared nothing in his faithfulness to God. And like God, his total faithfulness and excruciating vulnerability solidified an unbreakable bond of love with all of us. It is not rational. And given the ways we fumble that covenant again and again, it feels irresponsible on God's part to continue. But nevertheless, God pursues us. Nevertheless, God loves us. God may ask for everything, but as we are reminded each time we gather around this table, God also gives us everything. Amen.